Okay, so we're going to look at some more painting today. We're looking at painting of the Baroque period, that is the 17th century, the 1600s. And this is the first of two videos of Baroque painting. In this one, we're going to deal with two Southern Baroque painters, an Italian and a Spaniard. They are probably the two most prominent in their area. They are Caravaggio and Velazquez. And so we're going to talk about that. Then there'll be another video after this talking about the Northern Baroque, where we'll deal with Rembrandt and Vermeer. The next person I would cover in this period would be Peter Paul Rubens, a very remarkable and in my view, very strange artist, but I'm not going to cover him. I'm just going to talk about Caravaggio and Velazquez. They have a kind of, sometimes this is called the florid Baroque. They have a kind of style, which is very beautiful. And I think the thing about also Caravaggio and Velazquez is they really established some standards in terms of naturalism, some craft standards that really influence painting for the next 200 years. So let's take a look then at these two. There are many other painters, of course, in this period that we could do. But we're moving along here in our humanities class. So we're going to look at Caravaggio and Velazquez. On the left, we have a picture of Caravaggio, probably a pretty good likeness of him. It's not a self-portrait. On the right, we have Velazquez. That is a self-portrait of him. That is from the famous painting Las Meninas that we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes. So we'll talk about them in turn. First, Caravaggio. I say Caravaggio, infernal genius. He dies at the age of 39. There's something very drastically wrong with Caravaggio. Caravaggio is violent. He goes out and gets in fights. He is a guest at the home of the bishop, and he clubs a nobleman who's visiting in the home of the bishop. And he gets in lots of trouble for all these things and flees on murder charges. So there's something wrong with Caravaggio. And he also, he has a lot of pictures, very sensual pictures of young men. And there's a sort of cottage industry talking about allegedly the homoeroticism of Caravaggio. But Caravaggio, many of the people in the Caravaggio's paintings, many of the women in his paintings were notorious courtesans or prostitutes rather, with whom Caravaggio had very tempestuous relationships, not just one, but several of these people. So, I mean, now if you said that, I mean, I don't really usually care about the sexuality of these artists. All those high Renaissance people are gay as folk, as you know. But again, I don't, to me, that's not my emphasis. We go on far enough, we'll talk about those sorts of things. But in the case of Caravaggio, I think I would stress that he's someone very unfiltered. I would not be at all surprised if he was a bisexual person. He seems to have been. But a person who's just really not very restrained. He's a violent kind of person. And I think it's pretty amazing that Caravaggio is such a incredible painter, such an incredible portrayer. His technique is so realistic, so perfect. And it's hard to imagine someone so crazy being able to do that, because he was pretty crazy pretty much all the way along. He also didn't used to do drawings and sketches. That is, he didn't follow sort of a classical kind of workshop process to make his paintings. He'd sometimes just take his brush and sort of make indentations on the canvas roughly where the lines were going to be, and then he'd paint directly on canvas. And this added to his reputation for sort of arrogance and being this kind of Billy the Kid kind of character. He does appear probably to have been assassinated in the end. He was given refuge by a crime family that had connections to his family for a long time, but in the end, he betrayed the family by killing one of the sons in a duel or a fight somehow. He beat young men to death, stabbed young men to death. So I think when we're talking about his eros, that's something to bear in mind about him. His psychology is, again, he seems pretty Bathing. But look at this. The basket of fruit from 1586. Later botanists actually can identify, in fact, the lichens, the fungal growths on the leaves are actually that accurate. This was something, this is the kind of thing that young artists had to do, these kinds of decorative still lifes. Still lifes becoming extremely important in the Baroque period. And you can see here that incredible emphasis on realism. And Velazquez did that too. Judith beheading Holofernes from 1598, again, an earlier painting. She's kind of pulling back in disgust at this. The servant on the right has a bag ready for the head. This is early on, and he paints this picture of Judith beheading Holofernes, who was threatening, of course, the honor of all the ladies where they were. And later on, he becomes actually sentenced. I mean, Caravaggio becomes sentenced to beheading for a murder and goes into hiding and does a series of paintings of beheadings. I mean, the boy is really pretty nuts. Now, what is the real significance of Caravaggio? That is chiaroscuro, light and dark. And here we see a fairly classic example of that. Notice you've got all the black parts and then using the light coming through the window to shine particularly on the face of young Saint Matthew, who is busy playing cards until Christ comes in, and at that point he's converted. But chiaroscuro is that use of light to emphasize light and darkness, and this really took off and spread across Europe and made Caravaggio a star. His use of darkness and light that way, and this really became something of a fad among all the painters of the century, including in the North. Everybody thought that this was a wonderful effect. The crucifixion of St. Peter. He's being crucified upside down because he doesn't want to rival Christ and being crucified right side up. But again, you see the use of light and also Caravaggio's interesting use of people and patches and composition. Look at the composition of that painting. It's the St. Peter in the middle and then four sides of the star, right? The 4 points to the star. The conversion of St. Paul, a strange painting, and people thought it was strange at the time. St. Paul on the road to Damascus, and he's in the stable and the light's shining down. He's in an ecstatic state, lying on his back, and the light's shining down on him. But notice in this case, and what really sort of distinguishes these Baroque painters from the Renaissance painters is they have that grandiosity and seriousness of purpose that the Renaissance painters had, but in the service of a pretty rigorous naturalism. Even with these biblical themes that Caravaggio has, these are thoroughly naturalistic paintings. And I think even the prominence of the horse, of course, he's balancing out, as we'll see several times in these paintings, using the figure of a horse to balance out some weight of a figure on the other side of the painting. Always look in these Baroque paintings for rectilinear areas of the painting that are sort of blocked off. One of the basic things meant by composition. Another good example of chiaroscuro. Notice he's still basically using that vanishing point perspectival technique. Okay, this is a nice one. And we're going to look at Rembrandt when we look at in the next video, when we look at the Northern Baroque, and we'll see that these Northern painters make great use of this light shining on metal, shining on polished surfaces, shining on glass. And again, this is something that Caravaggio really sort of pioneered. And the bright use of the colors, the way that he uses light, I think creates an effect that the colors sort of jump off the page, jump off the canvas. David with the head of Goliath. Now here's something else um, about Caravaggio. You see the head of Goliath there. David feeling kind of bad about it. The younger man with the older man's head noticed the position of the blade that David's got in his right hand, and the younger man conquering the older man, right? And notice though also that the head, well, I'll just tell you that the head is Caravaggio. He painted his head. And it's not the only time that he does this. He has a number of these paintings. In this one, of course, the head of the older man done in by the younger man. It's Caravaggio himself. I tell you, the boys, the boy is nuts. The beheading of John the Baptist. As I say, in these sort of later Caravaggio paintings, he actually is under a sentence, and he's been sentenced to beheading himself, and he's living under the protection of some of his friends. I mean, in real life, Caravaggio is, and he paints a bunch of canvases, including this one, Salome with the head of St. John the Baptist in 1610. And again, that head is a self-portrait of Caravaggio. I almost couldn't believe that. I went and double checked. Sure enough. And again, you see that chiaroscuro effect, which is, now notice the way he just uses that completely for composition to kind of press the characters into this black background by, pushing them in there with that light. Okay, so Caravaggio, very bad news fellow, very passionate painter, and extremely influential painter. And then the other painter we're going to look at here, Diego Velazquez. Diego Velazquez, kind of the very cleaned up and somewhat evolved Caravaggio, I think. He was very well known from very early on. At the age of in 1624, at the age of 25, he was summoned after the court painter passed away, and on the basis of portraits that he had done, he was summoned. His last test was to do a portrait of King Philip, which he did. And he and King Philip IV actually became very close friends. And Velazquez lived in the palace. Velazquez bought art for Philip. Philip thought that the art collection was very important to the prestige of the country. And Velazquez traveled all over Europe, including Northern Europe, buying art. Europe was a smaller place than we might think in terms of these professional artists. These Northern and Southern artists knew each other, and they knew their work very well. As I said, Caravaggio was very influential, as we'll see when we look at Rembrandt next time. So Velazquez, the opposite of Caravaggio that way, just a very stable person who had this partnership with King Philip and stayed with King Philip for really many, many years. If you go to Madrid, you'll go to the Prado, the National Museum of Madrid, and see all the treasures that they have there. That museum is built out from the original collection, which was put together by Diego Velazquez. Diego Velazquez, the original curator of the Prado Museum. In addition to the fact, Velazquez, a lot of his job as a painter was painting portraits, both of the royal family. He was the only painter who was allowed to paint the king and the queen. That was part of his deal as the royal painter, but he also had a lot of administrative responsibilities in terms of running the king's household, which he did for many years. Caravaggio is kind of this fanatic, and Caravaggio says he's going to be absolutely realistic to a fanatic point, and we see the result of his work, his fantastic paintings that he does. And Velazquez picks up on that. You can see it as a real reaction to mannerism, if you wish. It certainly follows mannerism, and these people are leaving mannerism behind. And in Velazquez, we get this naturalism becomes very sort of rigorous, a very workmanlike kind of thing that is greatly admired. Velazquez, I think, amongst other painters that follow, Velazquez is one of the more admired, I think, of the historical painters, that his paintings are copied by Picasso and all kinds of people. So let's look at some of them. There's an early one, the old woman frying eggs. you want to look at some of the details in that painting. And I do encourage going on the internet and looking at details from some of these paintings. Let's look at the technical skill in terms of getting, now with all the work that they've done on light, look at the light shining in the bowls and so on. Now you get these Baroque painters really fill the space. You've got a real three-dimensional kind of feel because they're all about light. Another good example of a chiaroscuro, again, Velazquez learning chiaroscuro from Caravaggio, doing many of these portraits, still a relatively early work, and now a fairly radical portrait, really, because you notice it's almost all blackness with the portrait, even almost the bust of the figure coming up in, with by virtue of the light that's shining on it. Now, I think I mentioned when we were talking about Don Quixote and Cervantes. Remember, the first part of Don Quixote published in 1605, the second one in 1615 by Cervantes. And a lot of what was going on in that novel was this kind of breaking of the fourth wall and tricks that strike us, as we would use the term modernist today, self-conscious about the sort of artificiality of fiction, but also asking a lot of questions, as we saw with Cervantes, about our own identity and the way we sort of have a fictional account of our own identity based in the past and then the future. And I mentioned that I thought that maybe Cervantes influenced Velazquez a bit. And this is the painting that I always have in mind when I think that, although we're going to look at Las Meninas in a minute. But the Triumph of Bacchus, or sometimes known as Los Borrachos, the drunks, some working men coming home from the fields of a Friday afternoon, say, and they've stopped off for a few bowls of wine someplace. And you see the god of Bacchus and one of his satyrs over on the left there. But the men in the center, of course, are looking at us. And we are now, by implication, in this painting. That fourth wall, again, has been broken. And this is an interactive image in the sense that we are being challenged now by the eye contact that's being made with us by these men in the center of the painting. We're one of the workmen, I guess, and we're being invited in to partake and have a bowl of wine with these friends of ours, I suppose, or something like that. But we see now, and it's also very kind of Spanish, I have to say, this kind of playing a narrative trick, playing a kind of narrative game that kind of pulls the reader or the viewer into the work somehow to get us kind of involved, kind of morally involved somehow. Surrender of Breda, much more formalist kind of exercise, painted for the king's throne room. This was painted for King Philip's throne room. The Spanish on the right are the victors. The Dutch on the left have just been defeated. You see the magnanimous Spanish commander putting his arm on the Dutch commander as he accepts the defeat in the middle there. And you also see the way, again, what do we got? Another butt of a horse. They're all over the place, balancing out the composition. Also notice here, though, you've got a foreground and a background. You've got a very typical composition that you can see the lines of the horizon. You've got sort of four bands, oftentimes maybe two bands in the center and two slightly larger bands at the top and the bottom. And you see all the spears being held straight up on the right. That's the Spanish army. They're all good and ready to go. And the people on the left are all tattered. They've just been defeated. So a political painting, but one, again, that shows this kind of composition that we're also going to see in Las Meninas in a second. There's a self-portrait from 1640. This fellow traveled all over Europe, being the representative of his good friend, the King of Spain. So let's take a closer look at perhaps his most famous painting, a painting that's often called one of the most important Baroque paintings, one that's fascinated Pablo Picasso, I mentioned, the writer Jorge Luis Borges, I believe, has perhaps even a book about Las Meninas, and many other thinkers and writers have paid attention to this painting over the centuries. Let's take a look at it first, and we'll go back to the slide. Here's taking a look at it. And you see on the left there, that's the back of the easel, the back of where the painter is working. And you see the painter, that's Velazquez there on the left. He's looking back because he's painting, right? He's painting a picture of, what's he painting a picture of? He's painting a picture of whatever it is he's looking at. What is he looking at? Well, he's looking at you, at us. He's looking in our direction. We can see the mirror on the back wall, the two people, and of course it's the King and Queen of Spain, and here's their daughter and her retinue are just there while they're making the painting. This is the Infanta Margaret Teresa. She's 5 years old. She will go on to, unfortunately, pass away at the age of 22. She is the heir to the Spanish throne. She is the daughter, the only daughter of King Philip IV. Her brother is King Charles II, who's the King of England. But the fact that she's the daughter and heir of the King of Spain and the sister of the King of England isn't even the most impressive thing about that little 5-year-old girl there in the picture. There she is in the middle there. He has a bunch of pictures of her like that. She's also the Queen of Germany, even as we speak. And she's also the Empress of the Holy Roman Empire. And there she is with her dwarves. They had sort of had court dwarves. I don't know, but they had them. And two of her ladies' maids, handmaidens. Las Meninas really means handmaidens. And you see two women in the back there on the right in the shadows. Those are women who've been invited in. And it's a great honor to see the Infanta. So they've been invited in just to be able to sort of gaze upon the Infanta for a moment or two as a treat. Okay, so, and then you see in the back in the doorway, held open, and there's light shining, presumably from the outside, from up above. And that figure in the doorway is Jose Nieto Velazquez, Diego Velazquez's cousin, who was in charge of tapestries in the palace, and who was also one of the official door openers for the Queen, because the Queen isn't allowed to open doors for herself, so she has to have people who open doors for her. But you have to be especially deputized to be able to open doors for the Queen. So Jose Nieto was deputized to open the doors. Again, the sort of legend of this painting, and again, we can see it when we look at the painting. Velazquez is painting Philippe and Mariana, his queen, and they've got their daughter and her handmaidens and dwarves and the dog and so on with her. And they've started to get restless. They've started to fidget and make noise. And so the king, who's good friends with Velazquez, says, well, hey, let's make a painting of them. Let's make a painting of this kind of informal, homely scene, which was something that was, in fact, very rare and speaks to the intimacy of Diego and Philippe's relationship. He had been, Diego Velazquez had been working for Philippe for 33 years when this painting was made. He'd been living and working for this man for 33 years. So again, very, very close relationship there. And another funny thing about it is here on his chest, you see that red cross is the Order of Santiago. And this is one of the highest honors that could be bestowed upon you. But he didn't actually get that honor until 1659. It might be that Velazquez went back and painted that on himself, but there's also a legend that Philippe, the King of Spain, actually painted that into the painting after he gave Velazquez the order. So all right, so we covered that stuff. Now looking at the painting then, let's look at the painting for a sec. as I said, you can think of it in terms of three horizontal sections if you wish, but it breaks down into sort of two larger ones at the top and the bottom, and then a smaller one in the middle. You see the way those paintings are arranged in order to just block off that space, and then that large black area of the ceiling. And that's all just giving balance and weight to these figures in the bottom. Very carefully controlled light shining in from the right-hand side. And then again, there's that light in the back. And enough light, of course, for the reflection of the king and queen in the mirror. But you want to look at it in terms of rectangles and squares and see the way that he's got it all sectioned off. And this sectioning everything off and balancing everything out. You've got it's a dwarf and a little girl maybe, and then you've got the two handmaidens, then you've got the two ladies behind the two handmaidens, and then you've got the two gentlemen, Velazquez and his cousin, in the doorway. And then you've got the king and the queen in the mirror. And it's all kind of running back in that direction in these kinds of pairs of twos. This kind of these compositional elements are of the essence for these painters. They're very interested in having a balanced painting like that. Finally, a portrait of Innocent X, the Pope. I like this portrait. He did very many portraits. And if you look at a lot of Velazquez paintings, you're going to be looking at a lot of portraits. I like this one. Pope Innocent X, was not anyone with any kind of reputation as a very nice man. It would have been strange to have a sort of smiling or beneficent portrait of him. He was rather fierce as an individual. And Velazquez paints this portrait of him with a querulous and somewhat angry look on his face. And when he first saw it, the Pope, Innocent X, said, "Troppo vero." He said, "Too much truth, too accurate." He didn't like it. But then as time went by, it grew on him, and he actually had it mounted prominently in his quarters eventually because he came to admire Velazquez. And one of the things that's consistently said about Velazquez's paintings throughout his career, when he's compared with the other paintings in various exhibits that he participated in, for example, people will say he gets a truth. There's a kind of truth in his paintings, a kind of realism in his paintings that other painters can't achieve. So, okay. So anyway, just a quick little run through then of, as I say, the two really probably most basic Baroque painters, Caravaggio and Velazquez. Very entertaining painters with lots of interest in their pieces. And again, in the case of Caravaggio, rather hair-raising individual and life that he led. Nothing like that in the case of Velazquez, but in the case of Velazquez, his biography is more about meeting all these famous painters and famous collectors in the 17th century in Europe. So, so the Southern Baroque, and I think you can see by looking at those paintings, sorry, that for the next 200 years until the French Impressionists come along, these paintings really are this is really the most influential art style by virtue of the fact that what it is virtuosic kind of realism and a passionate kind of realism that really characterizes the Southern Baroque. And we'll take a look at the Northern Baroque then in another short video next up. All right, so I think that's good.